Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to Johanna, to Eva, and to Marcus for inviting me to give this keynote talk for your Nürnberg Digital Festival REMOTE 2020. So today, to provide some ideas and provocations for this keynote and what I'm calling artificial intelligence trainers, or the AI trainer as a data subject. I'll be discussing how workers in the quantified workplace can become potentially something that I am also calling provocatively smart workers, particularly when their unpaid affective labor adds value to products. In what is quite possibly, what I'm arguing, is a non-consensual triage of management, worker, and machine, which concentrates inequality and limits autonomy of workers via semi-automation of, for example, human resource and other kinds of artificial intelligence augmented tools and applications and practices. So here are some images that reflect my recent research projects, which have been for the International Labour Organization of the United Nations, for the European Union Safety and Health Agency, of course, the European Union, Brussels Luxembourg Stiftung, and other academic work, including my most recent book, as you see here, Quantified Self in Precarity, Work, Technology, and What Counts. And today I'll be looking at a large project that I've been doing for the European Parliament's Science and Technology panel. Now, the difference between the quantified self, as you see in the title for my last book, and the quantified worker, as I talk about, of course, it's not in the dimension of what is quantified, what is not quantified. That is important, but it's that the worker is not a free agent in the way that a consumer is, or someone who's like the notions of self that come out of the quantified self initiatives coming out of Silicon Valley, which was, of course, a community that thrived around tracking the self for empowerment and for fulfillment and health reasons. The worker is subject to an employment relationship, and this introduces significant complexity. So the extent to which a supposed black box of artificial intelligence and other tracking technologies as deployed in workplaces, such as people analytics and human resource decision-making, is itself impenetrable, has to be weighed up against the absence of, let's say, understandability, which is often assumed to lie within the materiality of the machine. And it is the case that algorithms' outcomes often surprise their designers, so it makes sense that understandability and trustworthiness are questioned and are some of the concepts at the forefront of the debates around artificial intelligence. But I argue what we're dealing with is not so much a black box at machinic level, but a set of contradictions, which lie in what is exposed and what is obscured via metrics. This has explicit implications for the materiality of workers themselves, everyday experiences, and of course, working conditions. And if you look at my last publication, which you'll find in Review of International Political Economy, which I've entitled Black Box or Hidden Abode, my interest here is to look at not necessarily what is counted, but what is not counted, which matters in the employment relationship. I'm interested to find out what is at stake when workplace decision-making is fully automated via artificial intelligence and rendered beyond human comprehension and accountability. And in that context, I'm interested, what are the changes that are emerging for the employment relationship? For example, how can consent be achieved, which is one of the criteria for data protection, for the data collection and processing purposes within the General Data Protection Regulation, for lawfulness to be achieved when these kinds of projects are rolled out in workplaces. How can any decision-making be made at all based on, for example, people analytics and other data collection processes, given the human tendency to make inferences based on quantification and, of course, the lack of legal protections around this human-based inference? And how can this be fair? I'm interested to find out in that context what kind of policies exist surround the shift to augmented, automated decision-making practices, and how can they protect workers' privacy and, of course, dignity. And to take this to a new level entirely, who and what sit behind the data sets themselves that are used to train within machine learning processes, the algorithms that are, of course, themselves used for what is being called the quantified, augmented, algorithmic governance or algorithmic management today. So what I'm going to deal with to talk about these questions, and specifically, I would like to speak about workers portraying a series of what we call in sociology ideal types of workers at a series of levels of abstraction to highlight the trends in the social relations of production and also of social reproduction as technology is ramped up to be applied within workplaces, to monitor and also to surveil work. And in particular, in the current context, to do with increased home working as COVID-19 continues to affect where we work. In the UK alone, 60% of the adult population are now working from home. Before this current lockdown, more than 1.54 million people started to work from home even before, and now 884,000 10 years ago. Up from this many 10 years ago. So we're really in a context of an increase in home working because of the current global pandemic, meaning that the types of software and the types of monitoring processes that exist potentially behind the screen within the home working environment are being rolled out in order to understand productivity of workers, where workers are, how they work. Now, anytime data is produced about a worker, like in these contexts, I argue there's an abstraction of the human experience. People's data doubles, in a way, are born by virtue of data collection. So this is a kind of a data subject, as I will be talking about, by virtue of the data protection, the collection, the storage, and again, the potential for the use of that data for training in some kinds of collection processes. There's also a possible situation whereby a data subject loses an element of their autonomy, which may have been more achievable within the qualified or within the more in-person workplace. If your manager stood behind you every day in the same kind of way that, let's say, one of the tailored software productivity management systems operates, you would start to wonder why they're there. So again, if we make that kind of metaphor, we're really looking at a shift toward potentially shifting accountability to, whereby without that human face, we've got a whole range of new possibilities for the concentration of accountability toward the worker herself. Now, there's a creation also for the potential of analysis under specific human selected criteria, which are presented themselves then as objective and objectified measures in profiling, which can come about through inference as well as much as the collection of data, which then can be understood and talked about as surveillance. This can lead to discrimination, structural violence, work intensification and acceleration, and of course threats to safety and health, which I've written about extensively for the European Union's agency. Now, particularly this can happen via the obfuscation of particular aspects of work, such as affective labor, preparatory labor, and what I talk about as autonomic activities, which are not usually measured in digitalized employment relationships. So why don't we talk about the new mysterious data double, or an ideal type of worker, as I'm describing them here, as existing within a black box. So what is actually occurring within her or within him when the specifics decision made about her or him become objectified through metrics gathering processes. In the new materialist frame, the unconscious is more influential on human behavior than the conscious. So in my last book, this quantified worker book, I talk about the autonomic self, which exists at the sub-level of the physiological, where a nervous system is oriented around body processes occurring without our conscious intention. And this is what I'm talking about and linking with the feminist arguments of affective labor. In the book, I focus on corporeal aspects of tracking, where wearable technologies used in warehouses, like the haptic armbands, which dictate where the arm is moving or within the fingers, for picking and stacking. There are smart devices being used in office wellness initiatives, which gather the heart rate, the steps, even sleep data about workers to make the link between productivity and health, where the data accumulation from these kinds of devices work to, in an ever closer way, granularize physiological autonomic selves at unprecedented levels. Okay, so the date that so what I'm referring to is the latest trend in digitalized workplaces, including the AI augmented tools and applications, which are seen in cobots, chatbots, people analytics platforms, and human resource interfaces being used today. Now, these are a couple of the publications and and where you can find them there. But what I really want to go into today is to talk about what's at stake for workers when they are when they become something that the GDPR calls and other policy, the data subject. Now, this section is mostly oriented around the policy dimensions, including the report that I've got for the Science and Technology panel, as I've told you, Surveillance and Monitoring, the Future of Work in the Digital Era. Now, this is the outline for that project. In fact, in 2020, this year, many of these things, of course, become increasingly relevant and important to look at, given the policy parameters have been understood to protect consumers to some extent more than workers. So there's a lot of questions around how to understand, particularly in the context of COVID, what this means for workers themselves. So in this report, the first thing I do is really interrogate the concept itself of surveillance and look at the digitalized space for working. Next, the next section, I look at the employment relationship and I look at how this is transformed. There are questions around trust. There are questions around what's called function creep and how data potentially could be used for different purposes than it is articulated within the ideal transparent relation where there should be, according to GDPR, a very strict and straightforward consultation process that occurs anytime data is collected. Next section, to look at the policy parameters also that predated GDPR, and the next section where you've got legal principles that inform the way those are organized and have been put forward within GDPR. For example, what I'll talk about today being consent, and a little bit about inferences and how some of these legal principles come under the spotlight when they are understood in the workplace, and the transforming future of work, the futures of work, as is in fact even in my job title. So when we look at those legal principles, they're also potentially going to impact at the real workplace level what we can understand as how to protect our own well-being. So that the next section then brings a lot of these two issues to light in specific legal country case studies, which have been worked on also with a lot of colleagues in the law context in different areas. And then I look at some best practices where, of course, each country is having to identify ways to ensure that GDPR is followed by way of the data protection officers for data controllers, which of course are usually the institutions and organizations that are subject now and should be compliant to GDPR. Then I've got a really nice range of what I've called worker cameos, whereby we've been able to speak to workers to find out about their experiences of intensified surveillance and monitoring at work today. And I provide the first principles and policy options, which I presented to the panel of Science and Technology just a couple of weeks ago, which of course are listed in my policy brief. So the GDPR, which has replaced the 1995 Data Protection Directive and is of course enforceable today, is written, and what I'm going to do now is give you some of the arguments that I've made in this report, which also go into how I'm viewing and thinking about AI trainers and the potential for the smart worker today. The GDPR is written with the individual as the focal data subject. And this is similar to the way that the 1978 French law on freedom and information technology portrays the individual, the individual citizen, and her right to privacy and also to dignity. So while this is not wrong, data collection operates at more levels than the discrete, and the use of it will impact people individually, as well as groups of all kinds, as well as all qualities, and as well as quantities. So there are special categories of personal data that are explicitly safeguarded by GDPR: race and ethnic origin, religious beliefs, political opinions, trade union memberships, biometric and genetic and health data, as well as data about sexual preferences and orientation, And the issue here is that there are a range of inferences nonetheless that can be made about these categories, which are can be made based on large grouping, whether or not anonymized, of data about, in fact, themselves other characteristics, which should be just as protected, of course, as special categories of data for individuals to ensure privacy prevails. So even where data about subjects is anonymized, machine learning and ultimately AI augmented workplace activities allows researchers, allows scientists, or potentially a manager to make judgments about patterns of data as they have been parceled out. My argument here is that the bigger the data set, the more powerful it is. And so we need to be looking at these issues around protection and privacy very carefully at the workplace level to ensure that other kinds of law are followed and discrimination does not result. So to make some of these arguments and to put some policy recommendations, briefs in this brief and the options for parliamentarians is to look at approaches and responses to data and its collection. And I'm saying that it should not be individualized, but it should be also collective. Okay, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I've talked a little bit about, and I've shown you the policy options here as they are, where we've got collective governance, collective data governance as within the first principle, and then some of the policy options as I have put them forward. Okay, now in the data subject, now I'll just quickly talk about two areas which of course have legal tensions potentially within them when we talk about the way that decisions are made, algorithmic decisions are made about workers. So there's the inference question operating at the level of the human and needs protections around it, and then of course consent. Now inferred or derived data is data whose exact categories are not explicitly made and they're transparent to in fact the data subject. So this is something that has some aspects of the data as still hidden, but nonetheless where decisions are made and conclusions made about individuals based on that data. So that means that inferences can be made about a data subject, which are, of course, not entirely accurate. They're not agreed by a subject and become part of a profile, and therefore could be classified as both non-transparent and potentially highly discriminatory. So this, of course, can have very unfair, direct implications for people's reputations. And there's really no good protection toward this in EU law, but there's some protections around this within GDPR, where the data subject can query inferences made about them. Okay, Watcher and Mittelstadt have also written about this extensively if you're interested in looking at this more, as well as in my report. The next one here is really important because, of course, consent becomes a difficult thing to talk about anytime we are discussing an employment relationship because there is an already a priori and inherent inequality to that relationship. But there are protections around it within the GDPR guidelines, and it's in fact the first one in the list of criteria that can be used to achieve lawfulness for any company that would like to protect, would like to collect data about workers. So let's just say then that workers, of course, are reliant on salaries, and increasingly we see casualization of workforces already. We see 0 hours contracts. We see a lot of question marks around any kind of welfare state or social protection of workers within the context of austerity over many years. And so while there are criteria that require this kind of consent potential for workers, it becomes increasingly difficult to identify whether that's possible. But the encouraging side of this is that the European Data Protection Board's new guidelines to update the 2018 GDPR as it's being implemented emphasize that requirements for consent under the GDPR are not considered to be an additional obligation, as it were, but rather as preconditions for lawful processing. And again, this brings up the question around the GDPR's appropriateness, suitability, and applicability for, of course, consumers as well as workers. And the arguments here is that there needs to be a lot of clear, explicit protection here. The guidelines also place a lot of responsibility on the data controller to ensure that collection and processing practices are within these legal parameters. And of course, there are also quite significant fines that a company faces if they are not compliant to GDPR. So consent could only be considered on a lawful basis in this update as it's read in 2020 if the data subject is offered control and offered a genuine choice with regard to accepting or declining the terms offered or declining them without detriment, which is difficult to see maybe in the employment relationship. But I would like to see a lot of commitment there and a lot of discussions with the labor representatives around the possibilities for concepts that could expand on consent as the identification of a bilateral relationship, but also bring it into maybe something being more collective, and consent being something that happens by way of collective bargaining and co-determination. Meaningful dialogue there being important. De Stefano talks about this, Valerio De Stefano talks about this as collective rights and fundamental tools to rationalize and limit the exercise of managerial prerogatives over individual workers, as well as over groups of workers. Okay, so here are some of the criteria within. This is the EDPB's update, as well as some of the GDPR text. And I won't talk about this a lot because I know we don't have tons of time. But what I would like to do is to talk about these ideal types of workers in a frame that really, again, brings in the possibilities for negotiation, for transparency, and for discussion, as well as what happens, let's say, to create the kinds of data that are, of course, themselves used in order to roll out the types of processes that we're asking workers to consent to. So if you've got data collection as being subject to the consent model, you've also got to find then that worker representatives should be involved in discussing which kind of software at all is being used, but where does that software come from? Where is the data that trains that software to become applicable? And this is where I start to talk about content moderators and data service workers. So these are the people working behind the screen when you are going, for example, with content moderators, which you'll be familiar with in a social media space, the ones who experience the trauma of, let's say, an image or a text on your behalf behind the screen, making decisions of what you should see and what you should read. Now, the work that they are doing also filters into being image recognition. So those databases that are created on the basis of the content moderators' work, these are some of the people that I'm talking about as being artificial intelligence trainers. And I'm saying to unveil the black box supposedly within which they work, we need to really talk about their experiences of affective labor. We need to talk about the unpaid, unrecognized labor that goes into that image recognition activity that, of course, itself is used for potentially AI training data. And data workers who are doing natural language process work and other kinds of linguistic activities to train the smart devices which sit within your smartphone or within your speakers. And I won't tell you their names, but I know you know who I am talking about. Okay, so the smart worker, I'm just going to conclude in a second here. The smart worker then is expected to work with, compete against, as well as to allow decision-making to be owned or at least authorized by machines. So there are a wide range of abstractions of thinking around these ideal types and what their role is in the life cycle of not just data collection, but also the artificial intelligence augmentation of the kinds of tools and applications that themselves operate to not just determine what work they are doing, how productive they are, the kinds of surveillance that surrounds that work. Another thing I'm saying about the kind of AI training work is very much that this is some of the most highly surveilled, tracked, and monitored work in the technology space today. So who then should the smart worker be? And I've alluded to this already, that there should be a lot more dialogue going into any decisions that are made about how work is monitored and tracked. And so that space needs to be really claimed by mutually beneficial social protection model where co-determination is prioritized, where individuals understand and people are made aware of at a collective level the kinds of things, the kinds of policy that can protect them, as well as meaningful achievement of that done at this level of conversation and discussion. Okay, I think that's my presentation for today, and I have 3 more minutes. So what I'll do then is simply turn off my screen, and I look forward to seeing you in the questions and answers and discussing this more as you want. I've put my email address at the bottom of each of the slides if there is any interest in discussion around some of the topics that I have introduced today. And thank you again to the Nürnberg Digital Festival Remote for having me today.